Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to discuss the poetry and thought of Gerard Manley Hopkins. He's a very interesting poet who I really feel an affinity for, despite having a lot of intellectual disagreements about, he's a very devout Christian and I am an atheist. And yet, nevertheless, I find the way that he uses language so compelling and the ways in which he combines form and content and the sonic capacities of language into this collective project. It brews forth with potential and excitement. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at 6 different poems that he has written. Inversnaid, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, The Windhover, Pied Beauty, Spelt from Sibyl's Leaves, and a final untitled poem. And this will serve as a somewhat comprehensive survey of his poetry, kind of combining various aspects of his life and his biography and going progressively through his life, seeing the way that his style changes. Now, Gerard Manley Hopkins was a British poet born July 28th, 1844, and died June 8th of 1889. He was born into an Anglican family and was born in Stratford, which is now London. At the time, it was Essex. And he was the eldest of something like 9 children. Born into an Anglican family, although he later converted to Roman Catholicism, and this created a situation of estrangement with his family. Even from his young university days, he showed a prevalent need for asceticism. He said, for example, that he thought that people drank too much water than the body really needed, so he promised that he would go without water for a week. But his tongue went black and he collapsed in the middle of drill and thus probably didn't finish this little ascetic journey. And he had various other situations of the sort where he was trying to actually use the bodily experience of life and, the living of daily events in order to bridge the gap between the profane and the sublime, the mortal and the immortal, the human and the divine. And I really think that we can see this in his poetry. He decided later, after becoming a Roman Catholic, to become a Jesuit, and that further created a situation of estrangement with his family because the Jesuits were seen as the worst kind of Roman Catholics that you could be. They're very involved with this spreading of the gospel and spreading of Roman Catholicism. He, for example, went to Switzerland where Jesuits were forbidden to enter, and nevertheless he wanted to go anyways. And he had studied at Oxford just before becoming a Roman Catholic and met Robert Bridges, who is a poet laureate of the UK that published a lot of his stuff posthumously after his death. His fame was primarily posthumous. He didn't really see much success in the recognition of his poetry, and in fact he died very young at 44, and we'll talk about that as we get into it. But we have an interesting situation in which Gerard Manley Hopkins subsequently saw himself being taken to different places for education and for teaching. He was in Wales. He ended up later in life in Dublin, teaching at University College Dublin, in which he taught Greek and Latin and classics of various kinds. But he found himself progressively throughout his life feeling more and more estranged, especially in Dublin. He was not very privy to the politics there in Ireland. He was very short and kind of was a very odd guy, so he wasn't necessarily the most effective teacher because he was unable to really feel at home in Ireland. And this leads later in his life to have this period be defined as he would write his terrible sonnets, which have a starkly more melancholy and lonesome feel than do the early parts of his works, which are extremely ecstatic, exciting, filled with the fervor of a young man. And he influenced a lot of interesting poets. He was friends, for example, with W.B. Yeats. But later in life, at the age of 44, he died of typhoid and was actually buried in Dublin, which I'm not exactly sure how he would feel about that. But despite, this very lonesome and melancholic end to his life, his last words on his deathbed were, "I am so happy. I am so happy," which to me seems very Nietzschean. Nietzsche, too, struggled with a lot of illness and struggled with, the ecstatic, artistic, expressive capacities in addition to this somber, melancholic struggle with the body, with the mortal, with the need to be something more, to effectuate something through the living of life. So I think despite Nietzsche and Gerard Manley Hopkins probably not agreeing on very much ideologically in the same way that I don't with Hopkins, nevertheless, I see a sort of kinship between them that I really think shows, for example, the ability of literature to really go beyond any individual thinker and to give us some sort of spring forward towards, the transcendence of an individual self in the face of a collective project. And what really sticks out about Gerard Manley Hopkins is his very experimental approach to language. He comes up with this poetic rhythm, which he calls sprung rhythm, which is meant to imitate the rhythm of natural speech. It's constructed instead of feet with a consistent number of syllables throughout, in something like iambic pentameter. You just have feet with a varying number of syllables, but most of the time with the first syllable being stressed. And this is something he is taking from, for example, Anglo-Saxon. He learned Old English, and he learned Anglo-Saxon, the likes of which we can see in something like Beowulf. And for him, this really escaped some of the potentially limiting qualities of modern English in his day. So, when he's learning things like Welsh, for example, there is a tremendous focus in Welsh upon alliteration and the sonic capacities of language that he saw as missing in the English of his day. And thus, he uses things like diacritic marks to help assist pronunciation and to kind of help follow a very flowing style. It's not very heavily rhythmic in the sense of being bound by meter. It is definitely contextualized by meter, and we can see some of the same conventions of English poetry that we can see in Shakespeare or Milton or Spenser or Chaucer or any of these other people. But nevertheless, he is moving towards something that is very similar to free verse. And really what he's trying to do here is almost like when Milton, for example, is escaping the confines of rhyme, of the poets like Spenser that were so prevalent in his day. In the same way, Hopkins is seeking to enter a new era and a new capacity for linguistic expression that is going to intersect with the divine in very interesting ways. And we'll talk about that as we now get into the poetry. Now, his poem Inversnaid is an early poem that he wrote, which is probably his most famous, and this really has the style, technique, and demeanor of the early Hopkins, which tends towards ecstasy and oneness with God through linguistic explosion. He's trying to really use the capacities of language to get beyond language, which is a bit of a paradox that we'll discuss further as we get into this. And it's accompanied by all of the devices that Hopkins is so good at alliteration, which is my favorite literary device. I think it just really makes a text fun, and it's something that we see in poetry more than we do in prose, but I love seeing it in prose in people like Joyce, for example. And he's also using a lot of onomatopoeia, where he's really trying to find some blend between the purely dead linguistic form of words with the concepts and ideas and affective states that they are supposed to represent. And thus, he's trying to bring out the creative capacity of language, because for Hopkins, he is trying to show the evocative capacities of every being, and language is itself a being. You could see it, as the English language as this one being, and also language as consisting of smaller beings, of stanzas, of paragraphs, of words, of phonemes, of individual letters. All of these are, of course, ways in which the word, that being Jesus, the capital W word, connects and can be seen in his poetry. Inversnaid is a Scottish river, and it goes, this poem, as follows. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his roll-rock highroad roaring down. In coop and in comb, the fleece of his foam flutes and low to the lake falls home. A wind-puff bonnet of fawn froth turns and twindles over the broth of a pool so pitch-black, fell frowning, it rounds and rounds, despair to drowning. Degged with dew, dappled with dew, are the groins of the braes that the brook treads through, weary heath-packs, flitches of fern, and the bed-bonny ash that sits over the burn. What would the world be, once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left, oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. And I think this is really interesting because we see the tendencies of language and of experience both to be a source of drowning in despair and in the pitch black of experience and our inability to have perfect clarity, but also the tendency for the wilderness and the weeds and the profane to yield the sublime. Not even to necessarily solely point towards the sublime, but somehow to actually reify the sublime through the profane. Through the deadness of letters, we're able to access, that next register of language. This next poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, to me is really interesting because it shows Hopkins' ability to combine form and content. I think that's something that Joyce really does good as well, and I think we can really see, Gerard Manley Hopkins' importance to modernism, to modernist poetry, and to modernist literature in general. And the form in this first stanza, there's two stanzas, consists of this really cool enclosure method through which Hopkins blends style and form together, and he uses the natural emphasis of the rhyming parts of the conclusion of each line to actually deliver a message about the created's relationship to the creator. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing in the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. And this is really interesting because we're really getting the gospel message in miniature here, showing this deeply intertwined relationship between Hopkins's life as a Jesuit and as a poet. Because if we look at this first stanza and we look at the final words, we can see that we have two different rhymes. We have flame, name, same, and came, and then we have wells, bells, dwells, and spells. And I think what he's trying to say here is that we all dwell within Christ, who is the Word, and thus also language and expression, who is always the same, right? He's this self-same thing which is able to resist change. And he came to die for our sins, right? This is the gospel message. And if you accept Jesus' name, you'll share, the flame of his sword. So flame, name, same, and came are all referring to these theological aspects, these divine aspects, whereas the others, wells, bells, dwells, and spells, to me focus more on the profane, right? We have the well and the rut of sin, of tumbling rim over rim in roundy wells. And this, of course, leads us into various spells of, for example, being concerned with liquids, which, for Hopkins, he's like, well, we don't need it as much as we think we do. That's why I'm going to do this little fast from liquids, and then we start to dwell in ourself, which is this indoor phenomenon. And this really explicates Hopkins' concepts of inscape and instress. An inscape is the unique self-identity that is always being externalized and realized through something's actions and its relationship to the world. And this, of course, is a problem because the quality of inscape suffers from an estrangement of the self via the inwardness of pure self-experience, right? You get closed off from the world and you get stuck in yourself, unable to see the radical conviviality of the world. As such, Hopkins wishes to use the Word, right? This is also the Word, as in Jesus, to effectuate the act of instress, which is this ecstatic release of energy, passion, fervor, and vitality that highly selved beings, humans, these things which have a very concrete notion of the self, can use to recognize the inscape of other beings. So this instress is this ability of the stress and power of a selved thing to actually come to some sort of relationship with other inscapes. And Hopkins sees this as the reification of the divine through each entity's ability to interface with another and form connections that transcend the self. And this transcendence, of course, is very, this has a theological meaning of, I think of the imago Dei, the image of God, which is stamped on every individual thing and which testifies to God's creative power, and also, for example, the idea of the Logos, or Jesus, or the Word, which actually allows for relationships to form between individual elements, allows for a prevailing logic or reason or even things like the future unfolding of history to actually make sense and form an order together. So we can see here that really we're getting the gospel message in a very lovely way, where we see, for example, the Father being attested to through the features of men's faces, which, this idea of men could probably extend beyond just humans. This could be, any being which has some sort of selfhood. And I really like the emphasis on the indoors within which one dwells, this self. It goes out. Myself speaks and spells, and it cries, what I do is me, for that I came. So we're actually externalizing the self through our actions. So this is not just purely an inward phenomenon. There is an ability for relationship through action, through externalization. Hopkins's poem The Windhover is really interesting because we see Hopkins's deep love for nature, and we also see a further explication of the concept of inscape. It reads, "To Christ our Lord, I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level, and underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off, forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend. The hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achievement of the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valor and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here buckle. And the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, oh, my chevalier. No wonder of it, sheer plod makes plough down Sicilian shine, and blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. And you can see that the alliteration and onomatopoeia is a whole nother level here. And we're, of course, talking about this falcon and the transcendent capacity of the bird, right? Through its active capability, the bird is able to live and glide astride the winds. And this acts as an analogy by which humans may understand how to live and enact the transcendent capacities of language through action, rather than solely through this purely dead linguistic representation. As such, Hopkins is faced with a challenge. How do we make language evoke or become extra-linguistic? How can language be used to escape beyond language towards something objective and not dependent upon and solely contained within an utterance? And in order to do this, Hopkins uses these literary devices that we mentioned, like alliteration and onomatopoeia and rhythm, in order to accentuate the physicality and the sonority of language. This allows for the possibility of a bodily affective approach to language, which to me succeeds in providing the possibility of extra-linguistic personal change. And I really like that focus on personality in Hopkins's literature. It's not solely about reaching for the ideal, but reaching this transcendent capacity through the individual experience of language. And thus, Hopkins's poetry is an enduring testament to the ability of literature to be at once a confirmation of the self and its identity, while at the same time being a violation and elimination of that very self through a linguistic encounter through literature. His next poem, Pied Beauty, I just really love. It's so short, but it has such an interesting message where form and content once again come together to really commemorate and commentate on, in this case, binaries and their ability to drive change in a universe that sings the praises of a self-same order, which is beyond change, which for Hopkins is God. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-coal chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted in peace, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change, praise him. And in celebrating the unique individuality of everything and its ability to evocatively serve a purpose that extends beyond itself here. Hopkins can be interpreted, I think, as radically convivial and transhuman in a way that takes into account the creative potential and uniqueness of every being of the universe, and also the centrality of these binaries which actually allow for change. The swiftness, slowness, sweetness, and sourness, a dazzling and dim. And this binary theme is echoed on the formal level, in which rhymes skip 2 lines in between each one. So we have things and wings, cow and plow, swim and trim, strange and change. And then we also have this final dim and him. And that's really interesting because dim and him are surrounding the word change. So this enclosure of change serves as a point from which we can actually change something. And we're thus linking the message of the ability for this transcendent change through interaction with the Father, and we're seeing that reified on the page. Because in between the dimness of life, we have a potential to interact with Him through change, through the recognition of that change, and particularly the dappled things, the rose moles, the fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, right? All of this plotted and pieced stuff that has been trimmed and strange and kind of makes us feel uneasy. Hopkins is saying, no, this serves a purpose which extends beyond itself, and which for him is God. Now, these last 2 poems take quite a dramatic turn. These represent part of his terrible sonnets. And of course, this is the result of many people who study Hopkins today are fairly confident that he probably had bipolar disorder, and so this led him into a lot of depressive states which predominated in the latter part of his life. He also, as I mentioned, had a feeling of estrangement from his self, his country, his culture, especially in Dublin, as well as this ascetic Jesuit lifestyle led Hopkins to often break from his poetry, which he saw as a distraction, as a way that interfered with his piety, sometimes interfered with his ability to focus solely on God. Now, apparently, after reading Duns Scotus, he actually changed his mind on this, but it seems that from these last 2 poems, he never entirely changed his mind. He thought that this world was always kind of holding him back. And I think this is something that I see running through Christian thought. We can see it in something like Ecclesiastes or Lamentations, for example, where there is this feeling in which the mortal is some kind of curse, right? And in the very real sense in which the fallen state of man is the curse brought on by Adam and Eve's sinning in the Garden of Eden. By eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we are now in a state in which we are fallen, and it really seems as if Gerard Manley Hopkins, in the later part of his life, has really fallen into this fallenness and is sort of starting to potentially doubt his project, his ability to do things like in stress, to actually be able to have this radical ecstatic relation with others. And I think we can really see this transition in his poem Spelt from Sibyl's Leaves. Earnest, earthless, equal, attunable, vaulty, voluminous, stupendous. Evening strains to be time's vast, womb of all, home of all, hearse of all night. Her fond yellow hornlight wound to the west, her wild hollow horlight hung to the height, waste. Her earliest stars, earl stars, stars principal overbend us, fire featuring heaven. For earth her being has unbound, her dapple is at end, a stray or a swarm. All through her in throngs, self in self steeped and pashed, quite dismembering all now. Heart you round me right with, our evening is over us, our night whelms and will end us. Only the beak-leved boughs, dragonish damask, the tool smooth bleak lights, black, ever so black on it. Our tale, oh, our oracle, let life waned, ah, let life wind, off her once skined, stained, vain variety upon, all on two spools, part pen pack. Now her all in two flocks, two folds, black, white, right, wrong, reckon but, wreck but, mind but these two, where of a world where but these two tell, each off the other, of a wreck where self-wrung, self-strung, sheathed and shelterless, thoughts against thoughts in groans grind. And I think this is probably the most complex of his poems that I've read thus far. There's so much going on here. The form is much more disparate. We can still see the rhyme scheme, as you can see here, but there's a lot of kind of disparate themes, and we can see some kind of the breaking down of his project. There's a focus on the fleeting nature of life in all its vicissitudes. We're combining the ups and downs of these binaries that were discussed earlier and that we also see echoed here of black, white, right, wrong, reckon but and wreck but, which I still don't understand what that last one means. Yet Hopkins is still trying to insist that this self-same eternal author of the universe, that being the Word or God, remains in spite of these changes. And this could also be a reference to, with this idea of the word, the idea of the meaning of the poem remaining in spite of the vicissitudes of, the sonic variation that we see in the poem and also the thematic variation and the conceptual variation. It seems that we can sense the spirit of doubt that plagued the later portion of Hopkins's life, in which the older Hopkins really struggles with keeping God in clear view in the face of the mass of changing faces in his life. Literally in the sense of, constantly meeting new people, new faces, but also metaphorically in the sense of changing living and studying locations and his estrangement from his family as the result of his Jesuit calling. Also this internal inconsistency about, is he supposed to be a poet or a Jesuit? Can he be both? And there is also this focus on the interdependence of all things, right? Two tell, each off the other. So both parts of the binary kind of hinge on one another and act together in this synchronous project. And this is testifying to this intricate and ecstatic order, which is, the divine, but which always threatens to flatten one's self-conception irremediably to the point of self-estrangement or death. And also, especially on this last line, self-wrung, self-strung, sheathed and shelterless, thoughts against thoughts in groans grind. He's sort of, collapsing into his own thought. There's this inward turn, showing Hopkins's doubts regarding the effectiveness or the feasibility of in-stress later in his life and career. Now, this last poem is untitled, but I think it bears a striking resemblance to Lamentations 3. I'll read just a few lines from the beginning. I am the man that hath seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He hath led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. Surely against me he is turned. He turneth his hand against me all the day. My flesh and my skin hath he made old. He hath broken my bones. He hath builded against me and compassioned me with gall and travail. He hath set me in dark places as they that be dead of old. And it goes on and on and on, but we're seeing, this is a lamentation, and there's this sense of estrangement that we can see in this poem. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh, what black hours we have spent this night. What sights you heart saw, ways you went, and more must in yet longer lights delay. With witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cry countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn, God's most deep decree, bitter would have me taste. My taste was me. Bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed the curse. Self-yeast of spirit a dull dough sours. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be, as I am mine, their sweating selves, but worse. Right, so very dark. There's these themes of growing old and impotent, like a aging dough, which is very reminiscent of that part. You know, he hath sent me in dark places as they be the dead of old. He hath made me old. He hath broken my bones, which we see in Lamentations. We're continuing to see those echoes of doubt and unsurety regarding the success of his lifelong project of asceticism, of piety, of transcendence chasing. And there's a really cool, it's a very simple rhyme scheme. We have this enclosure method again, where we have the top and the bottom enclosing these middle lines. And then for the last two stanzas, we have decree and me, C and B, and then curse and worse. Just these lonely curse and worse standing apart as his sort of last sense of bereavement of, everyone is cursed, but the non-believers are cursed even worse. So that being said, I hope this has been interesting in terms of understanding the poetry and thought of Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think it's just fascinating and a lovely thinker to read and really delve into more than you think you need to. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap and I'd really appreciate it. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.